Hello, everyone. Welcome to Scotty on the Horn. This is a podcast where I invite experts from a variety of fields and discuss topics that interest me. Today's guest is my good friend, Dr. Eva Pila. Dr. Pila started her academic journey at McMaster, where she earned her Bachelor's of Science. She then moved on to pursue a master's degree at McGill University and the University of Toronto, and finished her PhD at the University of Toronto. Dr. Pila is an assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario, or Western. She works within the School of Kinesiology. Dr. Pila's research interests involve body image and mental health, emotions and motivation related to physical activity, self-compassion and compassion-based interventions, and she's very interested in studying the conditions that disproportionately impact women's health. So this might include weight sigma, eating disorder, and breast cancer. On today's episode, Dr. Pila and I talk about body image, how it might impact both men and women, experiences in sport, how those might shape the way in which you understand your body and how it moves throughout the world. It was a good conversation, learned a lot, so thank you and hope you enjoy. All right, so I guess we'll start off. Maybe I'll just get you to describe what you're interested in as a researcher.
Yeah, sure. So broadly, I'm really interested in the psychology of body image. So mostly in terms of how that fits within a mental health framework. So the ways that we feel and perceive our bodies and how that impacts the way that we feel about ourselves more generally, the way that we relate to the world. And obviously, in being in kinesiology, also how the way that we perceive and feel about our bodies is related to the way that we choose to move them. So movement behaviors more generally. And so when I say movement behaviors, that can capture anything from sport to just, embodied movement practices that aren't really intentional or don't really have a specific performative skill to them. So really broadly, the area of body image. And so that can capture things like negative aspects of what we typically think of. So body image disturbance, which is where most of the research seems to be. And then also all the way to the positive side of things. So ways in which we can appreciate the way that our body moves, its function, how we are embodied. So the ways in which we relate to the world around us, that as well is captured all within my sort of framework of body image as it contributes to mental health.
So when you talk about non-performative, are you just talking about how, we hold ourselves and interact in the environment? Like, would I go swimming, or would I, is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly. And just like in the ways that our bodies basically move us throughout the world, and it doesn't have to be in an intentional act, like how we think of it from a kinesiology perspective of where we intend to move our bodies in a certain way for performative functions, like to enhance a certain skill, or we practice a drill to enhance a skill. It can also just be the ways in which our bodies represent our identity or who we are, or if your body looks a certain way, you might identify as an athlete, for example, or so it has sort of this identity and sociocultural implication as well.
Awesome. All right, so what I like to do is I generally like to bring people back to the beginning and talk about how experiences in sport and experiences in school may have shaped your path and how you got here. So let's start with sport. Did you play sport? What was your path?
Yeah, so I'm laughing because when you first were telling me about this podcast and you were telling me about how you usually ask your guests about their sport history, and I think the ones that I've listened to so far have all been really high performance athletes.
Phenomenal.
And then there's me, and so I'm probably very much an anomaly in the sport psychology world, and certainly even within kinesiology more broadly, but I have no skilled sport background whatsoever. So a lot of this is because I grew up in Albania. So Albania is a country in Eastern Europe. It is developing, and my parents immigrated here when I was 9 as a result of civil war that was happening in the country that we lived in. So that, I think, feeds into a lot of my lack of sport background. There was, certain gender norms around girls participating in organized sport, and there was also major issues in terms of access and like ability to engage in sport recreationally. There wasn't really like sporting organizations at a recreational level. They just didn't exist. So, sport for me in the way that I grew up was basically just seeing the neighborhood kids tossing a ball around, in an open, like a dirt patch, essentially.
Yeah.
And so
I've had like near pro athletes, and now I have the dirt patch player. Got the whole spectrum here. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that really, I mean, when I moved here, I was 9. And so, I moved here without really knowing how to speak English. And so being thrown in grade 4 into like a physical education class was fairly traumatizing, given that I had never even heard of hockey, for example, or like a lot of different sports that, in Albania, it's pretty sort of typical soccer, or what they call football, is essentially like the one and only sport. And so aside from that, I really wasn't familiar with the sport or athletic culture in a lot of ways. So that, I think, and just experiences of integrating as an immigrant, integrating in the physical cultural space in middle school was, I think, what definitely shaped the sort of things that I studied today, the way that I feel about sport. And and obviously when I talked about body image, I study self-consciousness. So, so how that impacts the ways in which we choose to move. And so yeah, that I think about sums it up. Since once I was in high school, I engaged in a lot more sort of physical activity related things, but never competitively. Like, I was on the track and field team, and all like very recreational. Pretty much my only athletic claim to fame was that I won an MVP award for orienteering. Oh. So I don't know if that's a sport you're familiar with, but it's essentially using maps to orient yourself in different things, and you run and like get little like tags in different open areas. And and it's funny because I can't even really read maps, but it's a partner endeavor, and so my partner was phenomenal at map reading, and I would just sort of run around and get the little tags. And as you can imagine, it's a very underrepresented sport, and so there was only very few participants, and as a result we won a couple like provincial awards. When the N is small, the you can go a lot further.
How does one get into orienteering?
You know what? I couldn't tell you. I think I stopped when I was at the top. Got the MVP award at athletic banquet, and I decided to retire at that point.
So always, walked away because you wanted to, not because you had to. Right?
So yeah, something like that.
Awesome. All right, so now you're the orienteering champion. You're graduating high school. You got all this confidence. You decide to pursue higher education. What's your path?
Yeah, good question. Well, somehow I ended up in kinesiology, and it was actually really funny because I even, just to show you how little promise I had in any athletic endeavor as a child, actually, I was in McMaster for kinesiology, and I was there because it was a, like super science heavy driven program. I was really interested in physiology, and, I wanted to pursue medicine, the typical sort of high achieving immigrant kid. And anyway, I pursued kinesiology, and as we know, lots of athletes or really highly skilled individuals are in kinesiology programs, lots of varsity athletes. And so I think those programs tend to gain a reputation. So I was working at the time, my part-time job at Tim Hortons, and I was at the drive-through, and I was met by my, I think, grade 4 or 5 gym teacher who recognized me, and we had a really nice little catch-up conversation. And he's like, oh, like, what is it that you're doing these days? And I was like, oh, I'm actually in kinesiology. And I think I just saw his face just absolutely drop at, who these kinesiology programs are actually accepting. Yeah. So Yeah. So, typical sort of med school hopeful, and that dream died pretty much as soon as I started undergrad. And I failed my first biology 101 midterm, and I was just around these super brilliant people, and it just just sort of realized that's not what I wanted. It's not like the competitive environment that I really thrived in or wanted to be in. So, and I was also actually really interested in psychology. That was always a big interest of mine. And when I wanted to pursue medicine, it was to go into more psychiatry, or more, I was really interested in the brain and how the brain functions and how people behave. So, a few courses in, I discovered health psychology, and that really changed my path in terms of what I wanted to do, because it showed me, okay, there's these two areas that you're really interested in, and there's this field or the subdiscipline that actually merges them. And that's when I sort of started discovering the research of Kathleen Martin-Guinness, who was basically my first introduction to this area. And I started doing some work with her as an undergrad thesis student, and that sort of got things rolling, and that's the path that I've been on. But it was really, I think, pretty early on that I found that path that merged both the study of health and psychology as well.
You probably weren't aware of how much of a springboard into research Kathy Martin-Guinness is at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Just a big hitter in our field. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I had a good introduction, and then she actually was the one who recommended, just given my interest, I was working on a body image project with her, and she was the one that recommended that when I was, sort of pursuing research further, she recommended my master's and then PhD supervisor as someone to go work with, just given my interest to stay in that area. So yeah, you're right. That totally, I think, forged a path and gave me an intro into what the research world is like.
Yeah. So you did your undergrad thesis, you applied, you got into McGill with Matthew Savaston, right? So we actually did some time together. Did we finish together, or did you left halfway?
No, I think you were a year ahead of me. Oh, right? I think you were a year ahead of me. Yeah. And so we overlapped for 1 year, and that was it. So, and I guess at the time, Kathy and Gord had some connection, obviously being the only people at McGill in Canada at the time. And so there's some overlap, and I think we were in the same classes or something, and our labs were just a few doors down. I mean, you were definitely a different Scotty back then, but
yeah.
but yeah, we did overlap just that 1 year, I think. And then I left to go to the University of Toronto to continue working with Kathy when she ended up pursuing a position there. And then I basically stayed in Toronto until moving to London, where I am now. So
you had a bit of an interesting experience where your supervisor as a master's student got to change schools, right? So she worked for McGill, then got an offer at the University of Toronto and switched over. I actually don't know and haven't asked you about that transition, but what's that like as a student?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And I think that it's probably something that a lot of students do end up having to face with academics, often ones in really research intensive roles that are moving around to explore different opportunities. So yeah, and I was a first year master's student, and I think, I found out that she was moving 4 months in or 5 months into my time there. And so, I really knew that I wanted to work with her. I'd gone to McGill to work with her. And so it wasn't really, I don't think, a question of whether I would stay or whether I would go.
So you followed her.
So I followed her to U of T. The only thing really holding me back was just that I loved Montreal. Yes. I loved living there. It was such a fun city. It was a great place to be in your early 20s. And the other thing too was that I had grown up in Hamilton. So when my parents moved, or when my family moved to Hamilton, obviously there was a lot of economic constraints too. And so I ended up staying at McMaster and going to the, living at home basically. So I didn't really have the traditional university undergraduate experience. So I was really wanting to go away for grad school. And so I tried to go to Montreal, and I tried to, get a little bit further away. And then I think really the only disappointing aspect was the fact that I had to move back to the, greater Toronto area, so to speak. And so But really, it ended up working out really well. I ended up loving Toronto and staying there for a while too. And there's obviously lots of great opportunity at U of T. And I actually moved with with a few people in my lab at the time, which also really, really helped the transition because we were all going through the same thing together. And, several of those individuals I'm still super close with and really good friends with. So that definitely can help ease the transition. But I think a lot of students have to obviously the consideration of, is it the institution that I'm here for? Is it the supervisor? What am I going to get if I leave? What am I going to get if I stay? Certainly considering some things around what will happen if you're moving and you're with someone who's just figuring out their way in their new institution as well. So there's going to be obviously a slowdown in things like productivity and whatever, but that really wasn't on my radar as a first-year master's student, as you can imagine. So.
So is your master's degree from McGill or is it from U of T?
It's from U of T, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so McGill's kind of like erased from my from my CV in a lot of ways.
Wow. Well, U of T is pretty good too. So.
Yeah. I still, McGill holds like such a lovely place in my heart still. I really had such a good year there. So.
I consider you alumni.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. And were you there for your undergrad as well?
No. So I did my undergrad at Concordia. So just down the road.
Oh, okay. Okay. Right. Okay. So you were just there for the 2 years.
Yeah. So there's like the rivalry between them, and obviously McGill's a little bit higher up. So when I was in Concordia, I'd get all this smug comments. And, what do people from Concordia and McGill have in common? They both applied to McGill, right?
Oh, okay. Right.
So then I came to McGill and I was like kind of hated them, but then I got caught up in it and actually really liked it. So.
And then you were probably the ones dishing out all the commentary to your Concordia friends.
Yeah. So for your master's study, what did you actually pursue? What was your project?
Yeah, so master's study was kind of a continuation of some of the work that Kathleen had introduced me to, which was trying to understand psychophysiological mechanisms of body image threats, essentially. So, and this is really an area that's been very understudied, and it draws from social psychology literature more broadly, but really trying to see when we are in an acute experience of threat, so social threat. So in my case, it was when your evaluation of the body is being threatened, or you feel that your body is being negatively evaluated. What sort of psychophysiological response does that elicit? And then how does that impact any outcomes, down the road? So things like how we decide to drop out of physical activity or disengage from physical activity, or it could even be things like performance outcomes. So there's evidence that women who are objectified perform worse at a motor task than men, or women who are not objectified. And so there seems to be this physiological link, which is what I was really interested in studying. And so at the time, and still now, Kathy, my supervisor, was doing work in self-conscious emotions. So trying to understand these experiences that are relating to how we feel about the body, and they're very social and valuative in nature. And they tend to have these physiological underpinnings as well, because depending on who you ask, they are evolved emotions. So we've evolved to feel this way for fundamental reasons for how humans interact. And so anyway, and so at the time, she was really trying to establish this one emotion that hadn't been looked at all, which is envy, or this experience of feeling envious of the way other people look, or the way that other people's bodies perform, for example. And so, from the perspective of an athlete, you can probably think of instances where you've socially compared your body or the performance to other people who are better, or you perceive to be better than you.
I had an example of that last podcast where I said I was trying out for hockey, and when I was 16, I was 5'3", and I did the jump test, and then the guy behind me just didn't even jump, stared me down, and slapped higher than I jumped.
Right.
And then I just went, oh my God, I don't have a chance. And it I couldn't even stick handle after that. I had no stick after.
Right.
I'm just not good enough. Like And that was just that body comparison. This is a grown man and I'm still a boy, right? So,
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's a really good example of how, that devaluation of yourself or of your skill can have this immediate impact on your performance or your ability to act, essentially. So we see this obviously in the body image literature. And so that's essentially what I was really interested in trying to understand. And so, how does our response to social stressors, which is really what these things are, how does that link with these self-conscious emotions? So this work can be a little like theoretical and conceptual in nature, and it's a lot less applied. So unlike much of the sports psychology work, which I think can, have very clear implications, this is a little bit more abstract in nature, but I was really interested in that area. And I'm still even right now, I'm preparing a grant with that basic premise in mind. So it's something that I'm super interested in, and it's an area that really hasn't been tapped into at all, mostly because it's incredibly difficult to manipulate these experiences in the lab. And so ethically anyway. So, how can we get little Scotties to feel inferior about their performance in a performance context and then track their outcomes afterwards? It's very hard to do in a lab setting.
And you'd have to do that associated with their body, right?
Exactly.
Like, hey, you weak idiot.
Right. And I mean, they've been doing this in social psychology for years and years of, these social identity based rejections or these evaluative threats. There's established protocols in social psychology that use these, but it's a lot different in kin and in our area, I think. So
I think they do that with math testing, right? If they tell women that women tend to perform worse in math and then give them a math test,
right,
it'll lower their scores. Where if they tell, if they were to, and I think the same across race, sometimes if they will highlight a certain race that is stereotyped as being worse and they bring that up before testing them, they can just butcher their scores.
Right. Yeah, exactly, like inducing a stereotype threat. Yeah. And actually for my master's at McGill, I don't know actually if you helped at all with this, because I was having a lot of the grad students act as some of the Confederates in the study, but I was doing the Trier social stress test where women were coming into the lab and doing a performance task and they were being evaluated by a co-ed panel of judges. I'd often bring in anyone who was sort of in the lab just trying to create that, very evaluative environment. But the women would basically have to come in and they would have to do a difficult arithmetic task on the spot. They'd be videotaped, and then we would assess their levels of cortisol, essentially, which is a stress hormone that we expect to be elicited as a result of feeling social stress. Yeah.
So that would be a measure of psychophysiological response, right?
Exactly.
Are you going to increase stress hormones? Are you going to increase the sympathetic nervous system response, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And
so is it going to cause changes in the body? And then will it also cause longitudinal changes in behavior?
Yeah. So in behavior and, we know that chronic exposure to cortisol, for example, is associated with worsened health. And so definitely, looking at those, that's sort of the implications anyway, but cortisol is extremely difficult to measure. We measure it using saliva. There's lots of different other ways we can measure it, but anytime you get into the psychophysiology, it just gets a lot more challenging to pin down, but I think that's what's interesting. So.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the applied perspective would be, hey, does highlighting certain inferiorities of the body create negative responses, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if we think about it from a performance or sport performance context, oftentimes in coaching practices, that's something that's used as a way of motivating athletes. So comparing them to someone who might be superior as a way of hoping that might induce a change in their behavior. And, when we look at this literature, it certainly doesn't suggest that would be helpful, or at least it might be helpful in the immediate context, but really it'll just lead to deteriorations of how someone evaluates themselves and their abilities. So
we've done it with aging populations, but not from a psychophysiological perspective, just a motivation perspective.
Okay.
Showed examples of some masters athletes. If you know what a masters athlete is,
a
highly competitive older adult, so 35 plus, who's competing at an elite level, right? So we would use, I say we, but our field, so I didn't do this study,
Hmm.
but people would position masters athletes and see whether or not representing their stories and their images would be motivating for other older individuals to become
Mm.
physically active. And what they found
Mm-hmm.
was that it depended on the older adult. So if it was a fit older adult, it would work very well. But if it was an unfit one, it actually would do the opposite. So you'd be like, look at
Okay.
this inspirational guy. He's 80 years old running marathons, and then it would completely turn the person off.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that really is the degree to which you relate to the social comparative target. If it's something that you think is achievable, then it might be motivating. If it's so far out of reach, you might either, engage in avoidance coping and dissociate from that goal being important to you, or you might feel a lot worse about yourself. So definitely. And I mean, in the culture that I was sort of raised in, and the Albanian culture is often, social comparisons are used as a method of motivating people. Like it's just a sort of like this embedded norm in the way that we function. And so I was constantly exposed to those kinds of cues. And so it is really interesting to look at them from the empirical perspective.
Yeah. Nice. So then you followed it up. You did a PhD. What was your topic on for your PhD?
Yeah. So for my PhD, I guess I switched a little bit, and I was interested in how the body is experienced, essentially how these emotions are experienced in a clinical population. And so my supervisor at the time was doing work in breast cancer, and body image concerns are quite relevant in the context of cancer, since their cancer diagnosis linked with increased weight, and increased body changes as a result of cancer treatment, and a lot of the factors that are linked with the cancer survivorship period. So my PhD work ended up being trying to understand how women felt about their changed weight as a result of breast cancer. That's probably the best way I can describe it. And I actually ended up leaving the psychophys side completely, and just really focused on the psychological experiences in that case.
Mm-hmm. So what did you end up finding? Any kind of key take homes from that study?
Yeah, I mean, probably the key take home so it was a mixed method study. So I did qualitative work as well as a couple of quantitative studies. So one was an intensive longitudinal study looking at how women responded to self-weighing or being exposed to their weight. And then the other was using longitudinal cohort data to examine what was happening to the relationship between their body and their body emotions and their weight throughout the post-cancer period. And I think probably the best way to describe the findings is a direct quote from a participant. So, if we're staying close to the data, and one of the papers actually that came out of that work is the title is this, and it's that the weight is even worse than the cancer. And so these women really described how their experiences with gaining weight, and particularly the pervasive stigma around what their bodies look like, was really, really challenging to deal with, and more so challenging than just going through the cancer treatment and the cancer recovery process. And the reason for that was because in our society, we often tell women that weight is something that they can control, whereas cancer is sort of seen as this thing that happens to you, whereas the weight is something that you can impact. And so because of this like very individual responsibility type way that we think about weight, the women ended up feeling horrible about themselves because they weren't able to change their weight. And so as a result, like the types of messaging that they were getting from their clinicians, from the teams, the interdisciplinary teams of clinicians that they were working with around how they should change their weight to be able to reduce the risk of cancer recurrence, that was sort of the really challenging thing to deal with, or the really distressing bit, is that they were told that they're responsible for reducing the risk of their cancer coming back, and they could do that by changing. So really, it's this like incredible amount of responsibility to put on the individual, when we know from the literature how many factors implicate weight gain and how many factors are associated with that, and then links with disease and mortality aren't even that clear. But anyway,
And the success rate of actually any kind of physical activity intervention is very low, especially
Extremely low,
especially
extremely
as it
low.
relates
And
to weight management. Yeah.
right, exactly. And I mean, the fact that, by women engaging in physical activity, they can gain a million benefits, and they can gain so many wonderful things that improve their quality of life, that decrease their psychological distress, that improve their mental health, despite seeing any changes in weight. And so, why not just promote that engagement in physical activity to get all those benefits? But instead, societally, we really do focus on the weight as the indicator, which obviously is a big issue.
And I find it interesting too, there's too much focus on the actual scale, like the actual weight, right? So if you're non-active and you get involved in physical activity, you probably are going to put on weight first, right? Because you're building muscle. Right? So anyway, I've been working out and I'm putting on weight. Yeah, that's good, right? So, but it's just bring that number down, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that number is used clinically as an indicator of health all the time. Yeah. And so obviously in the sport context, it's huge with weigh-ins, and there's been some recent media and some recent press on this, but around using that number on the scale as an indicator. And so, and one of my studies actually showed just that women's emotional responses and the way that they felt about themselves throughout the day was actually linearly related with the number on the scale each morning. And so if they, gained a pound or two, which, could be linked to any number of naturally occurring processes in the human body or a mechanical issue with the scale, those sort of things implicated the way that they felt. And just a week worth of seeing their weight every day and being attuned to those changes was, making the women feel a lot worse about themselves. So yeah, you're totally right that we really place a lot of emphasis on that number.
So another area of research that I find fascinating that you do is related to pride. So can you break that down for us?
Yeah. So, and I know you and I have had a lot of sort of conversations about this, about pride and the hubris. And so this idea of pride, so pride is just another self-conscious emotion, and we consider it to be positively valent. So typically it's a positive emotion, makes us feel good about ourselves. And it's essentially the other side of the other emotions that we were talking about earlier. So, if you compare yourself to somebody and you evaluate yourself as being superior to that individual, you're going to feel proud. So, and there's these different kinds of pride. So one side of it is linked to our achievements. And so we feel good because we do good things or we do things that are socially valued. And then the other side of pride is that it's linked to being superior to others. So there's sort of like this duality, or these two sides, one that we consider to be more socially desirable than the other.
Functional.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would be the difference? You say hubristic is the one where you're just trying to be better than others or gain positive valence from being marked as superior.
Exactly. And, the reason why that's problematic is just that it tends to be linked to worsened outcomes. So, or it tends to be linked to narcissism and some other, less than desirable traits and outcomes. And even in terms of, it has implications in terms of our ability to achieve goals. So we're less likely to pursue difficult goals than if we feel that it's our actions that are actually contributing to our positive outcomes, which, is linked to authentic pride, which is this, more desired type of or facet of pride, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in the sports psych literature, it'd be very akin to a task versus an ego orientation.
Yep. Quite similar. Exactly. Yeah. So one focusing on the self and the other focusing on a specific behavior. Yeah, definitely. And it'd be linked to very similar outcomes as well. But I think with the pride literature more broadly, I think one of the important implications or the criticisms of considering pride to be a good thing is that it's always contingent on the way that we socially evaluate ourselves. And so we don't really necessarily consider we don't give value to ourselves just for being humans, and the fact that we have inherent value, even if we're not the top performers, or even if we're not winning prizes or being recognized with accolades, we still have inherent value. And so pride is this emotion that's linked to doing good in the social eye. And so I might argue, and many others before me have argued that that pride might be something that can be quite challenging with regards to mental health, if we rely on it as a purely positive outcome.
Yeah, I could see that. So I was going to chat with you and get the counselor version. I'm walking in, I'm chatting with you about my history and my experience with body image. So I've had a complicated body image experience myself growing up, where I think I've had both negative and positive aspects of it. So, and I was going to get your thoughts on this. So can you have the two? And I guess I'll give you some reference here. So growing up, I came from a family that was like stupidly fit. Like my mom's 59 years old and has a visible six pack, like just some good genes. We always joke about being Rathwell fat and like whoever's the most overweight in the family at the time. So, which is something that's always been like on your mind, right? So growing up with a typical body type that would be praised for a guy. So I'm a more muscular guy. I'm lean. I'm proud of it, I would say. So I walk around and I feel good about my body and the representation that I walk around and how I look, but I'm never fully satisfied. Like I always know what's wrong with it and what I need to work on next. How would that be explained, right? Is that...
Yeah. And I think we could honestly sit here and talk about this for hours alone as a topic. And but I think there's probably two aspects here. One is that most people have complicated relationships with their bodies that develop and change over time. And so, often our early childhood experiences, you mentioned the family context, the types of messaging we heard about the body and from our social circles growing up really impact the way that the relationships we have with our bodies. And so one of the, the things of, it's the same sort of conceptualization as when we think of mental health. So, having mental health is not necessarily the absence of mental illness. So it's the exact same thing with body image as well, is that we can feel good about our bodies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are not concerned about specific things, and vice versa. And there's lots of different dimensions and domains and facets of body image, depending on who you ask and depending on what theories you look at as well. So, something like having body pride can exist in the same space as feeling ashamed about a certain aspect of your body, or a certain performative aspect, for example, or functional component. So, and I think that really the big picture of what you're capturing and the things that you're saying is that, the buy-in into this sociocultural ideal of what the male body should look like. And so you felt good about your body because it represented the ideal. It represented the idea of what men are supposed to look like. And so, and obviously the targets that you're working with, as you mentioned, are your family. So if the targets are all really high, then those are like the relative comparisons that you might have in your space. So I think the number one thing is always challenging the sociocultural messaging around what is a good body. And, someone who, like, for example, what might you say to someone who doesn't fit the sociocultural ideal for what the male body should look like, but still feels good about themselves and feels good about their body and what their body can do and that their body represents themselves and those sort of things. So what might you say in that regard? So, I think really like we buy in and we internalize so much of these pressures, and there's a construct that we measure in this area, which is like the internalization of sociocultural ideals. So we internalize it and we believe it to be true. But I think always stepping back and thinking about, okay, is this actually true, or is it just what I've been indoctrinated to think? And I might argue it's the latter.
So for sure, I went through it, and I guess just I played a ton of sports, and just being visibly fit, people would comment on it. So then you derive like, oh, thank you, like complimented. And then I got into like bodybuilding for a little bit. Got into that culture. So if you looked at my wedding party, like every guy is huge, right? So I got into that realm. And I think it'd be an interesting one to study because it's such a messed up space because you're never happy. So you're shooting for this ideal, and the way that it's typically done is that you'll bulk, right? So you put on a bunch of weight, and then what you do is you peel it off, right? Bulk and cut. So when you're bulking, you're happy with your size, but you're unhappy with your fat proportions. So you feel overweight, you feel like you can feel it on your body and it doesn't feel good. And then when you cut, you basically have about a month window where you're that optimal body, but it's not, you can't do it, right? You can't maintain it because you're basically starving or you're under your caloric requirement. So then you start getting skinny. So then you're lean, but you're not big enough. So you're always like 11 months of 12, you're either big but not lean enough, or you're lean but not big enough. And then it's this constant battle of not being there. Aside from maybe 3 weeks or
Right. That's so interesting. I've never heard the training process explained that way, and that makes so much sense. But yeah, I mean, that like bodybuilding is extreme body control.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that can really mess up your relationship, I think, with the way that you think about yourself and how much control you think you have over changing your body. And I think one of the things too that I'm quite critical of is in kinesiology in general, we are around people who are fit and who really buy into these sociocultural ideals. And ironically enough, we're the ones that are promoting physical activity, exercise, sport to the broader population that really does not fit the way that we are in terms of activity or fitness or any of those things. So we are the ones that are promoting these things, but we don't represent the people we're promoting it to.
I remember, I don't know if I said it to you or to Kathy Savaston, but I think I pulled Kathy over because it was her whole lab. And that year, it just so happened that the lab was a bunch of petite women who were super physically active and fit and, were the 1% unachievable fitness level. And it was all on body image, and they were interviewing people about their issues with body image. And I was watching the seminar, and I gave her a tap, and I'm like, you realize that this is a whole seminar of people of unachievable bodies asking people how they feel about not having one.
Yeah. 100%.
So it was very interesting.
Yeah. And that's actually something that I know I've always sort of confronted every time I've studied this type of work. And now I've really gotten into the fat activism sphere of academia, which is fascinating. So it basically looks at fatness from a social justice perspective.
That's like a body positivity movement.
Yeah, but it's more than body positivity. It's mostly just like, I mean, obviously our internalizations and our ideals around what body should look like, they're just socially constructed. And unfortunately, our social constructions of what makes a good body ends up marginalizing a really large proportion of the population. And so, so anyway, all this work to say is that, oftentimes you have to recognize what is called thin privilege. And it's this idea that like me walking through the world as a thin woman, I've always been small, always been petite, and me walking through the world, I'm not going to experience the same thing as someone who is higher weight might. And I'm not going to have the same relationship with the public in the world that someone in a more marginalized body might. And it's the same privilege that is linked with any other marginalized social identity, whether that be, color of someone's skin or any other really marginalized identity. So yeah. And it's interesting. It's the same sort of thing as when you have white folks who are studying racial issues. So I think like the number one thing is that we have to recognize that and put it up at the forefront and just say, yeah, like I will never be able to understand those experiences because I haven't lived them. And so that to say doesn't mean that I've never experienced body image issues or anything like that. But it's certainly not in the same way, or certainly not in a way where my body is marginalized in society. So Yeah, your point stands. And I even think of that now too from a supervisory perspective of, okay, like what sort of lab environment am I creating where, am I building just a lab of thin white women? And that's something that I think about all the time. Like, how can I make the environment that I set forth for students to be interested who are in different bodies or different social identities that are outwardly expressed and those sort of things. So yeah,
it's really interesting walking around the sports psych conferences, right? So I'm 6'1", and when I go to a sports psych conference, I'm short.
right. Yeah,
I'm a short guy at those conferences because most people are basketball players or volleyball players or athletes. So it's why it's an interesting. Yeah, you go to many labs and they could be confused as a elite sport locker room, right? If you took away the contextual information, if you just said, here's 4 bodies, what do? They would probably say, oh, they're varsity athletes, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing, like, the identity politics actually do have a really big impact in the way that we study, in the topics that we study, in the ways that we study them. Like sports psychology, for the most part, and certainly this is going to be a broad blanket statement, but for the most part, treats sport as something that is inherently good and something that needs to be promoted, and looks at all the positive outcomes that can result from sport. But that's not everyone's experience. And I would argue that most people's experience isn't that. And so that's the way that I'm sort of studying sport, or the way that I think about sport, is looking at, okay, who doesn't engage from the beginning, who disengages, who has bad experiences with it, why, how can we help, what can we do societally to reduce those negative experiences, and how can we make it more inclusive for, a large proportion of the population, not just the people that, are represented in our sports psychology population. Yeah.
So again, coming back to the masters athletes, we get criticized on that because we are pushing that we think it's good. Now, part of what our movement is we're trying to make it more inclusive because we think there's benefits.
Right.
Unfortunately, only a small percent of the population gets to reap those benefits. So our goal is to make it so somehow, policy wise, we can change it so more people can benefit from sport.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be the competitive sport. But yeah, we get criticized saying like, you are way too positive about this sport movement. And the reality is it's only super rich, old, tend to be white guys who play master sport, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's the really interesting thing too with representation too. And obviously there's been lots of discussions around Black Lives Matter movement about, can we, as in our really privileged positions, can we really be the ones that can actually do inclusivity work? And lots of scholars would be pretty critical of that, is that you need people with a lived experience to be representing the experiences of the people that they're trying to target. And so in the fat activism movement, there's a saying, now I'm blanking on it, but basically there's no way to do this work without us. You need to represent us to be able to actually have meaningful impact and represent the experiences. And so it really always challenges me. And I don't know about you, what sort of how you feel when you're challenged around that type of work, but it really makes me think okay, why am I doing this, and how can I do it in a way that's more representative of the people that I'm trying to advocate for.
It brings me back to my exercise psych class at McGill, where there was myself and Jeff, my first guest, and we were getting all the pushback on, and I just felt like it was an I hate sport class, but now that I'm out of it and have thought about it more, it's some of these important issues. But coming at it, I was fresh into my master's. I didn't really think too much about all these other areas, and I'm just like, why is everyone attacking sports? Sport's so great. It was the best thing in my life, right? And then people are saying well, it's one of the only activities that you will do where people visually can see if you're bad or good, right? And then I would fight back, and I said, well, I'd make it up, and I'd say in elementary school I had to play the flute, and everyone could hear how bad I was. And then they're like, now you're just being condescending and argumentative for no reason. And I said, and I feared playing the flute every day because because there's that performative aspect. I'm like, you're being a dick. So, yeah.
But that's the thing. I mean, and even like listening to your other guests too, and how we talked about those are individuals that had, for the most part, fairly positive experiences with sport. And so, or at least there was some identity tied into sport. And so, and maybe that's too broad of a statement and it doesn't capture everyone's experience. But I think, like when I think of my experiences in sport, they were horrible. And it made me feel so bad about myself. And, and they weren't like environments in which I felt that I thrived at all. And I've literally had to work for years and years on reconstructing my relationship with activity in a way that it's healthy and that it's not evaluative and performance based. And that took a lot of unlearning of what I was taught that sport should be. So
yeah, it took a while for me to be able to be reflective enough to figure this one out, because I was always good at sports. So whatever sport we try, I'd be one of the better people at it. So then, but in gym class, like I didn't care if someone was bad. I was like, oh, you're bad, whatever. I'll pass you the ball. Just no big deal. We're playing a game here. Right. I'm like, why do they even care? Like, why would they not, some people wouldn't participate. Right. I'm like, well, who wouldn't participate in gym class? Why? Like, that's so dumb, right? Doesn't matter if you're bad. But then I thought about it and I said, okay, but what if someone asked, so myself, I'll go on a tangent here. My first episode was with Jeff, and Kels goes, oh, Jeff has such a nice voice. And me, like bar voice. So I thought about it and I go, all right, well, what if I were tasked with singing in front of a group, right? I would be mortified, because I'm so bad at it. And okay, that like just in finally connecting another activity that was public that I would care about, and I would just be mortified for everyone to see how bad I am. I don't even know if I'd be able to voice a word if it was serious. Like if I had to take it serious and actually try. So then I guess that's where you get the kids who would goof off in class as to not, try the activity, right?
Right. Yeah. Like if you, and that's, there's perfectionism work in that area too, where if, or from a procrastination point of view as well, where if you don't try hard enough, then you'll never have your best effort negatively evaluated. And so it's just like, and it's such a self-protective thing. And, like, I mean, I would argue that it's human nature that we fundamentally want to be good at things. That's how we're socially evaluated and that's how we're socially rewarded. And, if we think about our social hierarchies and those sort of things. So it's hard for us as humans to do things that we're not good at. And in a physical education environment, I know you just said that you didn't care, or you weren't nice, you were still nice to the kids that weren't good, but I can tell you that was not my experience as as a kid who wasn't good. Like I would say that PE classes were like the environments where I felt most like bullied essentially in throughout school. So then it forms this like identity around, and it keeps you from trying things. And so and I think like a lot of the girls and the women that I interview and talk to have those similar experiences that they can recall. And then, imagine also from the other side of things, imagine being a larger bodied kid or someone with a differing ability and the kind of additional scrutiny you would have in those sort of environments. And no wonder you would never want to do them again. Like I wouldn't blame anyone. So yeah, it's interesting to think about and to have these reflexive conversations.
Yeah, body representation. And then I guess I was going to ask you sort of beyond sport, just to maybe chat about how body image can impact one's sense of self. So how it can be part of who you are as a human being.
Ooh.
So being someone who played sports my whole life and being someone who's been more fit, let's say my whole life, it is part of who I am. Right? So to the extent of it, when COVID happened, we had one day off, right? So we went and saw a doctor. Kels was pregnant at the time. And then we said, should we be teaching with this happening? And they said, absolutely not. Get out of the classroom now. We don't know what the
Right.
effect is. Right. So then we closed down. And then the next day I thought, oh my God, the gyms are going to close. I need a home gym. So I bought,
Right.
like I said, Kels, I need this, right? Like, I don't know what I'll do if I can't work out. And like, it was terrifying to me to think that
Right.
if I don't have a home gym and the gym's closed, then I lose who I am. Right. So
Right. Right. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. And it's making me think of this new area of research that I'm really going into now. And it's really not a new area of research, it's just a different way of thinking about the same thing that I've studied for as long as I've studied these research topics. But
yeah.
it's this idea of like a attuned movement, or what I'm calling compassionate movement. And it's essentially like engaging with bodily movement in a way that is intuitive, and it's listening to your body and listening to your body signals rather than looking at different markers or standards of what you should be doing. And so, if we think about it even from like a motivation point of view too, for you, as you mentioned, it was, my day-to-day routine around exercise would be disrupted. And without even thinking of, okay, how is this going to make me feel? It immediately is, well, I need to make sure that context is put back in place so it doesn't shift or have a dramatic effect in the behavior that is such an integral part of my day. And so, that's one thing when we talk about making exercise routine or habitual, I might sort of challenge against that and just wonder if, okay, well, what if we just listen to our bodies and listen to what our bodies are asking of us? Like, for example, I got a standing desk because I get super restless if I'm sitting all day. So, and it's not necessarily like an exercise integrated thing that I'm engaging in, but rather it's just a responding to how my body feels. And so it's that same sort of thing where if we can just listen, be mindful of how our bodies are feeling and respond acutely rather than more broadly considering exercise as something that we have to do, then it can really shift that relationship. But it's a completely radical way of thinking about it from, I know, the way I was trained and, the more predominant rhetoric in our field. So, but I think too, it's, if you think about like, how does exercise make you feel and why do you do it? What are your reasons for doing it? A lot of people do it because it makes them feel better. It reduces their stress. It alleviates anxiety. It helps them feel capable. It shows them the ways in which their bodies can move. It helps them interact with friends. Like, those are all wonderful reasons or motivations to be engaged. And so I don't think I'm answering your question, but I think you're touching on this idea of like identity and the exerciser identity, in which there's been quite a bit of work. But my argument is just that I think when we think about exercise as something that is integrally tied to who we are, we lose the way that we respond to it in a more intuitive or attuned way.
Yeah. So what I wonder is, and I think there's pros and cons, obviously. So as I said, there's troubled experience, and even I'll give a story of my brother after too. I don't know how much theory or how much is just my own theorizing about this, is that I think that if you want to have behavior change, let's say you want to get in better shape, the best thing you can do is not set a goal to have, I don't know, lose 10 pounds or to do whatever. You should set an identity-based goal. So recently I said, I'm going to try to become a cyclist, right? Like a high-performing cyclist. So instead of saying I'm going to lose weight or I'm going to do something like that, I say, and then like through that lens, I become that person. And so then when I ask myself daily questions, what would a cyclist do, like an elite one do at this time? Probably not have this to eat, would probably bike, get my 20K. I started, working on increasing my lactic threshold. That's like my new experiment. I always do physical experiments on myself, but so now I'm trying to see how close I can get to an elite cyclist physique. So that's my new, but I find by setting an identity-based goal and becoming that identity and making that body part of your identity, then you're going to be less likely to give up, because you have to essentially reject who you are and who you're trying to be to not do that. So that's my habit
Yeah.
hacking
Yeah.
philosophy.
Yeah. And I mean, even from like a goal achievement point of view, certainly makes sense. Like if it is, congruent with with who you want to be and with your future self and all of that. But I guess I would just, my question to you would be, what is your motivation for wanting to achieve that identity? And so the why behind it, like why do you want to be an elite cyclist as an identity? Why do you want to embody that identity?
So I'll give you the reality. One, I just want to maintain a physique. COVID switched things up. I used to do alternative fashions. So now I play hockey again, but like I wasn't getting any physical activity and cardio. And usually my cardio I get through sport. So I had none. Right. And then I was starting to put on weight pretty rapidly because I don't like to diet. I just like to out exercise my diet, which doesn't work for most people, but I've managed to do that. So then I bought a spin bike. And I didn't like the spin bike. So instead of setting a goal of a weight thing or a goal of like a number of kilometers or something, I said, okay, I have a spin bike. How can I habit hack this activity to become the best at it? So then I said, I'm going to try and become an elite cyclist, right? I don't know what their wattage was, what their wattage per weight is. And now I have these goals and then these behaviors that I've learned. So how did elite cyclists do it in the past? So I'm trying to mimic that path.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, so this is super interesting to me. And I think it is it's just making me think of how that approach, which I think how a lot of people relate to exercise as this thing that just has inherent value in itself. Yeah. And also something it's like virtue signaling, like it's a virtuous behavior that we societally, if you present with that identity, you get better treatment, you're held to a higher standard. And so obviously we have a human motivation to want to seek that. Yeah. But from that like intuitive movement perspective, I just wonder, like, does it change the relationship you have with it if your goal is so external, or if your goal is,
For sure. So, I mean, I do have so if we're talking self-determination theory, where there's a variety of external to internal motives, I would say I have the whole onslaught of it. But my motivation that has pushed me to exercise has been external, and it has, like, in all honesty, been not like a good portion of vanity-driven, external, weight, body, image type, maintaining this physique that I worked hard for, that I'm proud of, and I don't want to lose. So it's not, on the term of a motivational standpoint, a good place to be. But where I think that and not that it's good psychologically, it's good from a commitment perspective, is I tied it to an identity. So looking a certain way was who I was. So if I don't exercise, I will lose who I am. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the way that I am. That's the way that my brother is. And I would say in 12 years, I could count on one hand how many times I've gone more than 2 days without working out. Like,
interesting. Yeah.
So it's effective at doing a behavior that I know is good for me.
Right.
But I just tied it to who I am, right? And that does have negative aspects. So I said I'm going to bring it back to my brother. So he's even worse than me in the sense that, like, he's so addicted to working out, but also for external reasons. To the point where when I got married, he was my best man, and we're getting ready, for me to get married. my brother's nowhere to be found, right? We have no idea where he is. All the groomsmen are in the room. We're waiting for my brother. Like, okay, we're getting dressed. We're getting ready. He's nowhere. No one knows where he is. He's in the gym doing like a tricep workout.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, Kaylin, like, what are you doing? You're wearing a suit, first of all. You can't even see your tricep pump, right? But just, he had to do it.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, I mean, these are things that are socially rewarded and reinforced, I mean, these are extremely valued, and they're also the way that our culture and society thinks that like the purpose of exercise should be. So of course we're all exercising for vanity and external reasons because that's the messaging we're getting. No one is telling us that we should exercise because of the inherent joy of movement.
Yeah.
But why not? You know, like
yeah.
I think my biggest motivation in this area of work in general is that question that you brought up before around doing this thing that's good for me. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to get there at no matter what the psychological cost. That is like, for me, that's something that's the most interesting and is the act of engaging in exercises, all the wonderful benefits of physical activity, are they overcome by the psychological consequences that we take to attain that commitment or that level of like super rigorous and rigid commitment?
Oh yeah.
That would be my question.
I don't know. So as long as I'm capable of exercise, so that's where it came down to, I need a home gym. And I said, look, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to be the difference between you living with someone who you want to live with or someone who's an absolute awful human being. Because the guilt, the negative emotions associated with missing a workout, especially missing one like 2 days in a row, 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row. I'm telling you right now, I don't know how I would handle being forced to not work out for a week.
Right. So this is so interesting. I really feel like we're getting somewhere here because this is so fascinating from like an eating disorder perspective. If you were to be communicating these same ideas with regards to food, then from a psychological perspective, you know, it might be recommended that you engage in, as you said, one of these like sort of personal experiments where you, like an exposure therapy, where you see what would happen when you don't exercise for 4 or 5 days and see what happens to that fear, that anxiety. And that's exactly what's done in eating disorder treatment. And it's so interesting how when it comes to exercise, I think we normalize it. And, you know, if you were to be saying that to most people in the general population, you would be very, very much validated. Like, oh, I wish I could feel in a way where, exactly. Like, it's such a good thing. Good for you. So it's just so interesting when you think about how much we normalize, you know, compulsive exercise, for example. So
if we flip this and I just replaced exercise with like, I can't eat that, right? I'd be classified as probably having a disorder.
Right.
But because I'm not skinny, instead I'm muscular, it's not just like, okay, it's good.
Right. Yeah. And like the whole like identity or self-worth contingency, you know, where the self-worth is so tied up in a certain aspect of what you can do, then that's really interesting too. But I think, I mean, really it all comes down to the fact that in our society, we value these things, we normalize them, and they're not issues. And so because I study the you know, when they do become issues, then I'm really interested in, I guess, changing that narrative. But it's hard.
When I was at McGill, I had access to DEXA scanner. So because of the physiology master students, they let me scan myself. So I started building programs to see how effective they would be. And one time, so I said, I like to do experiments on myself. So I wanted to know how lean I could get without losing muscle mass. And then I built this, I started doing gymnastics training, which was really fun to learn and do. Did that, but I was working out twice a day. So I do an hour and a half of lifting, an hour and a half of cardio. So 3 hours a day. I was doing intermittent fasting, low carb, like everything I could think of, and piling it on top of each other. And I did lose, like I got to about 8% body fat before I started losing weight. And then I got to 5% body fat. And then I stopped because it's actually dangerous to go below. But I remember doing it. And like I was just kind of taking notes on how I was feeling. And so I looked the best I've ever looked. I was very proud of the way I looked, but like life sucked. I couldn't sleep. I had a really hard time sleeping. It was not depressed, but similar symptoms to depression in the sense that like you lose any interest in doing things that you used to find interesting. And then your social life sucks, right? So hey, let's all go out for a meal. Well, I can't go to the meal because I don't know what's like the exact proportions of that meal and,
Right.
and the calories and what's that going to mean,
Right.
and what am I going to do? Drink water and have a salad and ask them to hold the dressing and give me all the right. So it was
Right.
that one was an interesting experiment. I
Yeah.
I went hard on, but it was
Yeah. So it just sort of sucks the joy out of life.
yeah, it was a horrible life. So when you see those
Yeah.
people on the magazine, like who we post as like the picture of fitness or men's health, whatever, at that time, I would go as far as saying as I looked like those people,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was the worst psychological,
Right.
social feeling that I've
Right.
ever had, right? And when you
Right.
see the guys in bodybuilding, men and women who step on the stage, they're so unhealthy, but they look what we think in a certain way is of as health,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the other thing too, where I think there's just like this immediate link that we make between appearance and health, and
Yeah.
and that's so problematic in so many ways. But it's true. It's the way that our field and our society really does construct health, and even in doing some readings in the sociocultural field of healthism, and the fact that we think of health as this moral imperative, and that being healthy is so virtuous, and that if we can be healthy, why wouldn't we? And so yeah, it's really, I find this sort of stuff fascinating to think about. And I mean, there's so many like really interesting sociology perspectives on this I'm just starting to get into now, but it completely flips the way that we think about the stuff, and the way we've been trained in it, and it really flips it upside down. But yeah, you really, I think, bringing up a good point is that we cannot be equating health with appearance in any way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you'll like my last one. So the last podcast I did before you was social constructions of the body. So
Oh, amazing. Okay,
yeah, so
cool.
I had Dr. Brayton, sport sociologist in my department.
Awesome. Cool.
Was
Okay.
so smart. Yeah. It was,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah. So I'm sitting.
Oh, now I'm worried about following up. Maybe put some other people in between us.
You're great. I'm always the consistent meathead in each episode, so don't worry. The floor is low.
Yeah, you talked about that in a couple in your other ones too, right? About that your goal is really just to set the bar low always, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
yeah.
If the bar is low, it's easy to impress, right? You'd never want to come in high and disappoint.
So how tell me, I'm so curious, how has your podcasting experience been the past few weeks? Like, you just started this a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
4.
Okay. So like, what are your lessons learned? How have you felt things have gone, and is this how you envisioned it going?
I've really enjoyed it. I do get scared sometimes of stepping on a landmine because I'm pretty open about things. If ever I do, and there's a listener that's mad at something I said, hey, send me an email and I'll have you on and you can teach me something. I just want to learn, right?
Yeah.
And learning through mistakes is how you do it. So that's one fear I do have. But so far it's been really good and really positive in terms of the feedback. And what I was saying was, part of why I did this is there's a couple of reasons. I want to, 1, show there's human beings behind the academics. 2, demystify academia.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3, just talk about stuff I find interesting. So it's been so fun for me, especially with COVID. I'm a very social guy. So just this has given me whenever we had a 2-hour chat, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So I get to reach out and talk about things that interest me. I get to learn new things, and I get to chat with people I enjoy chatting with.
Right.
So
I know, and the thing too with, I mean, conferences now, and not really knowing what that whole sphere is going to look like over the next few years, or maybe indefinitely, just thinking about when's the next conference, or we're actually going to be able to catch up with people and socialize and do all the really important socializing that we do from a non-academic perspective. And so this is such a good way of doing that. So I'm really glad that you've done this.
Awesome. Thanks. So I guess one of the things I like to do on this podcast is get you to suggest, someone who you think is doing good work right now in research. So it doesn't have to be in the
Ooh.
field of body image. It could be just, sport, exercise, psychology, motor learning, whatever it is. Is there anyone you think is doing good work right now and this is part me thinking, who can I interview next?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Let me think. Maybe I'll look at my Twitter to see who's recently been inspiring me. So I would say, honestly, the two people that come to mind that have in the last year and a bit completely changed the way that I think about things and made me really reconsider my work are doctors Rachel Calgaro and Dr. Angela Meadows, and they are both at Western.
Yeah.
And they, I know you said it doesn't have to be someone from my area, but inevitably it is.
Yeah.
And, they've really introduced me to work from a like fat activism and advocacy perspective.
Yeah.
And it has just really opened my eyes to challenging a lot of the ways that I've thought about things, a lot of the assumptions that I hold and the ways that I think about exercise and movement in the body. And just the conversations I've had with them, even just in this past year, have been just so informative. So those would be, I think, two to check out. I'm trying to think of if there's anyone else that I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, perfect. And then one other thing I like to ask people, doesn't even have to be academic. It could be a thoughtless, like just purely experiential task. But if you have a book that you've read that you think that, given perhaps a little bit more free time now, what would you recommend people read? And it doesn't have to be academic.
Okay. See, this is one thing actually that I'm really trying to work on, and I don't know if you have this issue, but is all of my reading, my recreational reading, tends to be on topics that are linked to my research, and or like psychological topics, and so I find myself never really reading fiction. I'm always drawn to nonfiction, and it's always in my realm of interest when it comes to a topic. And you brought this up in your other podcast too, around sometimes as academics we become so embedded in our way of thinking about and our identity as academics, and that is me to a T. Like I cannot veer from that. But I'm trying to think of, the book that probably changed my way of thinking the most is a book that's called, it's basically a self-help book, but I think it's really valuable. It's called When Perfect Isn't Good Enough.
Yeah.
Have you heard of it?
No, but it sounds perfect for an academic.
Yeah, and it's basically just like dismantling the idea of perfectionism, and it completely changed the way that like my relationship with my work, the way that that I feel about my work, and the perfectionistic tendencies that we have as academics. So I know you said to pick a non-academic book, but I'm sorry.
Oh no, yeah, it could be or could not be academic. I think the last one my guest asked me about a book, and mine was the same thing. It was like a behavioral psychology book.
Okay.
So it's not sports psych, but it was behavioral psych.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And that's the thing, obviously we study, especially from a psychology perspective, we're often a little bit self-indulgent, and we study things that we are inherently interested in. And I think to some degree you have to. Sometimes the work is a bit of a grind, and there's having that inherent interest and curiosity in the topic is going to keep you going. So I think it's unavoidable to some degree.
Yeah, for sure. So do you think at this point, when it comes to body image, when it comes to some of the research that you're interested in, have we covered mostly everything, or is there anything that you want to talk about before we end this podcast, maybe as it relates to your research, the topic, or even grad school or academia? Part of this is also talking a little bit about academia.
Right. I mean, there's just so much more we could talk about, obviously, in the topic. I think one thing that really didn't come through that maybe I should mention and really should have in some of our discussions is, I think there's a misconception that body image is basically like a woman's issue, or it's very gendered. And so, you shared some experiences that you've had. And, I think considering the gendered bit is really important. I did a little bit of work with Dr. Stu Murray. He's a clinical psychologist at the time, he was in the University of California in San Francisco, and he's an eating disorder clinician, and he specializes in the male presentation of eating disorders, which is muscularity orientation, essentially. And it was just fascinating to consider that, again, how normative that tends to be in male athletes, in the exercise science / kinesiology world. And one of the really interesting bits about it is that oftentimes these disordered behaviors or cognitions, particularly in males, go unnoticed or overlooked, or they're less sort of socially recognized. And so there's some great work being done by Stu and his colleagues around reducing some of that stigma around men or non-binary folks, or sort of thinking about gender more along continuum, how gendered these experiences tend to be, and how our current study of the body and of body image really is very gendered. And I think we can often miss the mark on recognizing and helping men, particularly with body image concerns or relationships with exercise. So I think that's something that didn't come through as well as it could have.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with it. And it came down to the perspective of, I know even myself, a lot of my friends were, if you think of a clinical problem, it has to render, either impacting yourself or others negatively, right? And I know a ton of guys whose working out has ended a relationship, because they, put off spending time with them because they had, they were working, they only had 3 hours off, and then 2 hours were at the gym, and one went to someone, to their significant other, right? And if that was any other behavior, not necessarily male typical behavior, it would be classified as a disorder, right? Or problematic. But we haven't really tackled the male side of it, and it's just normalized. So no, that's good. It's a good thing they're in shape, right? So, and actually more people should try and do that too, right? So it's the one where I think there's probably a hidden disorder that we're not only not recognizing, but we're also almost encouraging other to have it, right? So
yeah, exactly. And especially with like gender role socialization, that really feeds into it too, where we societally don't encourage men to talk about things that they're just uncomfortable with, and negative emotions and those sort of things. So yeah, that would be an important point. And honestly, my take home is that I really think we just need to decouple the body from exercise and fitness goals, and we need to think of them inclusively. Like, how can we promote feeling good about our bodies, but also promote doing activities that we feel good about and that we enjoy and that bring us pleasure, rather than engaging in activities to change our body. So that would be if I do anything in my career, that would be something that I'd like to work on. On dismantling.
So I'm going to ask you maybe one question, and we'll see, and we can always delete this if you want later.
Okay, good lead in.
I'm going to ask you to toe the line here. So one thing I've been wrestling with, knowing that there's issues with this decoupling of the body and physical activity and sort of taking away that valuation, how would you toe that line as a kinesiologist when trying to be more accepting of, bigger bodies, alternative views of it, knowing that certain bodies, let's say a BMI above 30, is associated with adverse health? How can, and I mean, I don't know the answer. I imagine if you know the perfect answer, you're probably going to be a millionaire someday. But how do we handle that, right? With trying to not shame and not, put people down and create psychological issues, while also maintaining the fact that there are some physiological issues that amount from being too big.
So yes, I think there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. But I think that there's the literature that links a higher weight to mortality and morbidity actually isn't nearly as clear as we have come to summarize it as.
Yeah.
So there is a curvilinear relationship between weight and mortality. There is,
Can you explain what that means, curvilinear? So just for
actually like individuals in larger weight categories actually live longer. So from a mortality perspective, than if you look at like the largest scale longitudinal cohort studies that have been done, the relationship is not quite as clear. It's definitely not linear in the way that we think of it, where higher weight equals shorter lifespan, worsened health. Yeah. And so that, right away, that's an assumption that we have. The other component is that and this is what weight stigma scholars would argue, and there's certainly so much building evidence now, is that it's not actually, if you control for weight, yeah, and assess things like how stigmatized individuals are or how excluded they are because of their weight, those are the psychological experiences that actually link to worsened health. And so in a lot of the work looking at this, it's really like, and fat activists will say this, is it's not my weight that's killing me, it's the stigma that I have to be exposed to. And so, when I was talking about that work that I've done around, or that I'm interested in looking at how like body-based rejection, social rejection is linked with worsened health, that's really the link. Is we know that when people feel stigmatized about their bodies, we see the psychophysiological response, which then is linked to the worsened outcomes, regardless of the weight. And not to mention all of the literature looking at, if you look at fitness, controlling for weight, if you look at fitness, that is the best indicator of health outcomes, not weight. So regardless of weight, if you can promote activity and engage in movement and be active in ways that you enjoy, in ways that empower you, that is the best predictor of health outcomes and mortality and those sort of things. So really, like, if you take weight out of the picture, we can still continue doing what we're doing in promoting activity and promoting movement and promoting these things that we know are linked to better health outcomes. But that has to be at the point where we decouple weight from the equation, because weight doesn't matter and weight doesn't equal health. And so that would be my argument. And that's something that I would be that I could, again, like talk a lot more about, but I think there's, this area of research that's really showing this from many different perspectives, the psychological, sociological components, and a lot of the public health weight stigma research is starting to seep into some of the more mainstream public health messaging around weight immediately being a bad thing that we need to eradicate. And physical activity, we know, is not the effective way to do that anyway. So
that's very cool. So we've come full circle, and your psychophysiological response is now becoming a prominent element in maybe your future research.
That's right. We have
very
come
cool.
Full circle.
I just learned something very new. So I gotta look into this more and do some more research. That's awesome. So it's really the physical activity is what matters.
And that's the thing. I think sometimes I have to be careful when I'm talking about these things, because it can come off as hating on activity and hating on movement.
Well, because weight and physical activity are so coupled, they're almost seen as the same thing.
Exactly. Societally, they certainly are. And we don't do a very good job in research of decoupling it. So
when you say, no, weight doesn't matter, that's taken by many as physical activity doesn't matter.
Right. Exactly. So it's not that I think that physical activity is this terrible thing. I think it's a wonderful and has so many wonderful benefits. Just the way I'm critical of the ways that we promote it and the way that we link it to the body. When really, like, if you're active in an embodied sense, you can feel so connected to your body and so in tune with yourself and what your body's able to do. Like, that's such a beautiful feeling that I think we often take away when we have these very external outcome-based goals around, changing what our body looks like. So
and the listeners, I'm not entirely a vanity-based person, and I find to improve my adherence and to improve my experience with physical activity, I always do try and find these intrinsic things. So when I spoke about the gymnastics training, it was so cool to learn how you could manipulate your balance and body in certain ways. And now with the biking, I don't know, I love just trying to see how bad I can make my legs feel, as much as that's like just how much burn can I push through.
Right.
So
right.
I do, first time I've coupled that with a positive interpretation, but yeah, so I do look for these actual components of the game. And that's why I love sport more than physical activity, because
I could totally see that. Yeah, absolutely. I do think in sport, you can capture the embodied benefits of movement a lot better than in a structured session at the gym. Absolutely. Yes. Sport is so many, like the social aspect, the cooperation, that's also, you can't get that in a structured exercise sense. So
and even just the way you pursue the same activity. So imagine I say sprint 100 meters, right? And then someone goes, no. But then I throw a ball.
Right.
I say, get the ball. And what do? Sprint 100 meters, right? But one is enjoyable and one sucks.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think too, there's research too on play and like having fun in activity and movement. And sometimes we just have to look at the way that kids, and as Katie grows up, for example, you're going to watch the relationship she has with movement and how it can be fun, and she isn't doing it for outcome goals. She's doing it because the process is just enjoyable. And so it's almost like we should really look to kids to see how they engage with movement to get back to that, because it's fun. Moving your body can be really, really fun. So
well,
cool.
I think we're coming up on the end here. I think we're pushing 2 hours now. So
wow. Okay.
So any last thoughts before we go, or?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on, and I really look forward to seeing what you continue to do with this and learning from your other guests. And and I enjoy how much you've engaged with it.
Thank you. I just appreciate it's fun, every time I come on, I ask as I said, the meathead question, and then I actually learn something valuable. So I change my frame of thought. And then as a guy who's interested in learning, I always leave and then I go and try and read more about the topic. So it's just awesome. And I've really enjoyed it. So I hope other people are enjoying this.
Yeah, I think it's great. Yeah. Good for you. Have my full support.
Well, thank you very much. All right, cool.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. So that was fun.